I had worked at that company for 20 years. Then one day, the boss's son, just 30 years old, walked into my office and told me to pack up my things. He said I was too old to keep working and that my presence no longer fit with the company's new vision. I smiled to myself because he had no idea that I was the one holding the keys to everything that really mattered. Susan Bell, 53, had devoted her entire life to the family-owned company, a major player in the tech industry that she had helped build from the ground up. Though not the founder, she was the heart and soul behind the company's steady growth, the architect of its financial strategies, and the keeper of critical business relationships. For years, she worked tirelessly, pushing through constant pressure and high expectations. In return, she had a stable, if quiet, life built around the kind of success that seemed unshakable. But then, one cold autumn morning, everything changed. The company's founder, Susan's longtime boss, and someone she had deeply respected, died suddenly of a heart attack. The shock sent waves through the company, but the board remained confident they could weather the storm. They believed in the solid foundation they had all helped create. What no one expected was that his son, Michael, would be the one to take over, a young man with little management experience and even less understanding of the company's delicate inner workings. From the moment Michael stepped into the office, things began to shift. He wasn't just different in personality, he brought with him a vision that many saw as unrealistic. Where the old boss had valued loyalty and long-term dedication, Michael quickly made it clear he saw no use for people like Susan, people who had stuck with the company through thick and thin. To him, they were outdated, too cautious, a barrier to the kind of change he wanted to bring. When Michael called Susan into his office, she already knew something big was coming. "Susan," he said, "I've reviewed your file and decided that you're no longer aligned with the company's new direction. I think it's time for you to retire." The words weren't a surprise, but they still felt like a slap in the face. In that moment, Susan felt pain. Not because she was being let go, but because the boss's son, a boy she had once treated like her own, had no understanding of the true value of her contributions. But along with that pain, another feeling began to rise. Something quiet but deep. The spark of revenge. A slow-burning fire that flickered to life deep within her. Susan left the office, closing the door gently behind her. But inside, a decision had already taken root. No one could erase 2 decades of devotion so easily. She would not go down as an afterthought. And no one, not even Michael, knew that she still held the keys to everything worth saving, if she chose to use them. She spent a few days thinking things over. Not because she had any regrets, but because she knew that, from now on, she had no choice but to fight. She had lived a life with no regrets. But being cast aside, not because she was incapable, but because of her age, left her cold. It was a deep wound, but also an awakening. The day after she was fired, Susan didn't rush to find a new job. Instead, she walked around the city, reflecting on everything that had shaped her into the woman she was. Independent, intelligent, strong, and yes, maybe a little cold in business. But she had also once been warm, gentle, willing to help anyone in the company who needed her. She didn't understand how Michael couldn't see that. The abruptness, the disrespect. It made everything around her feel like it was falling apart. The truth was, she wasn't just angry about being fired. What cut deeper was Michael's ignorance of what had been built. He didn't understand that strategy wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet or vague dreams about innovation. It was relationships, nuanced, long-standing partnerships with clients, employees, and allies. People like her, like the old guard, were the backbone of the company. They were the reason it had survived and thrived. She remembered her first days at the company, how young and full of energy she was. The old boss had seen something in her and trusted her with real responsibility. He taught her that in business, honesty, patience, and a little bit of calculation were the keys to success. And now, all of that years of effort, loyalty, wisdom, dismissed with one clueless decision from Michael. But Susan was not someone who gave up easily. She couldn't let Michael destroy everything she'd helped build. She knew she couldn't act right away. But if she had learned one thing over the years, it was patience and strategy. She began to plan not out of blind vengeance, but with deliberate, quiet precision. She wouldn't make a scene. She would let Michael dig his own grave. From a distance, Susan started tracking every move the company made. She reconnected with old partners, people she had cultivated relationships with for years, and quietly began collecting information. She wasn't in a rush. But step by step, she started to see the cracks. Michael, with his dreamy visions and lack of insight, began making mistake after mistake. He cut funding to R&D. He hired inexperienced people for key roles. The company began to falter, financially and in its most valuable partnerships. Everything Susan had carefully built was starting to fall apart. She watched it all unfold from behind her screen, never rushing. Each of Michael's bad decisions brought her one step closer to the moment she would return. And when that time came, she would be the one holding all the cards. One small move on the board, and everything would shift. Susan wasn't waiting for luck. She relied on intelligence and years of sharpened instinct. She quietly started rebuilding the most important connections from her career. Even though she was no longer with the company, she still held a kind of power Michael would never comprehend. She began meeting with her former partners, the ones who weren't just colleagues, but longtime friends. People who had seen her dedication, who knew the value she brought. Some had already left the company after Michael took over. But they still respected Susan. And they were willing to help. One evening, she invited James, a longtime financial partner, to dinner at a quiet restaurant. James was the CFO of a large firm, someone who had worked with Susan for years, long before Michael had pushed her out. Their conversation that night was just the beginning. Things between them started off gently, but over time, Susan began to shift the conversation toward deeper matters, things Michael clearly didn't understand about the company's financial relationships. James, I don't know if there's anything I can actually do, but I have a feeling that Michael is hurting the company. His decisions lack depth, and I'm afraid we're going to pay a heavy price for that ignorance, Susan said cautiously, looking James in the eye. James looked at her, his eyes lighting up as if he understood her concerns. I've noticed that too. Michael's changes have forced us to adjust a lot of our strategies. But not everyone dares to speak up. What about you? Do you have a plan? Susan gave a faint smile, her expression no longer tired. I just want to reclaim what I've lost. And I know we can turn everything around if we act at the right moment. James didn't respond right away. He just sat silently. He had known Susan long enough to recognize that she didn't speak lightly. Her approach was different, never impulsive, never loud, but every step she took had meaning. After that evening, they stayed in contact. Susan began building a network of strategic partners in the industry, people Michael couldn't reach. Former executives, financial experts, and longtime friends were more than willing to help. Susan wasn't in a rush. She knew that every conversation, every rekindled relationship, was part of a larger plan to restore her power. A week later, Michael made a controversial move. He wanted to replace the entire board of directors, cut key positions, and bring in inexperienced people, just because they were his friends. This was the moment Susan had been waiting for. These changes would destabilize the company's already fragile partnerships. They would trigger doubt among longtime allies, and that was exactly when Susan would strike. She didn't need to make a big move, at least not yet. All she had to do was help the company's partners see that continuing to follow an inexperienced, short-sighted leader like Michael was a mistake. Quietly, she began circulating financial analyses and sending out carefully worded questions to the company's major partners. The numbers, the shifts in strategy, the early signs of instability, they all started to come to light. Just a few subtle moves, but they planted seeds of doubt. And then, once she knew the time was right, Susan understood that she no longer needed to stay on the sidelines. It was time to act. The quiet days of observation and indirect strategy had run their course. She was done standing by and watching the company she had spent a lifetime building be dismantled by a young, arrogant, inexperienced man. Each of Michael's poor decisions was driving the company closer to collapse, and she would not let that happen. The time for avoidance was over. Now it was time to make her final move. She started with a private meeting with old partners, people who still held influence in the company's financial operations. Susan knew they had a voice, and she would use the company's instability to show them they needed to step in. Michael's changes, though masked by confidence, were slowly undoing everything she had built over the years. Even though Susan had worked tirelessly to build strong relationships with these partners, she knew that trust couldn't be rushed. She couldn't shock them into action. Instead, she would take a subtle, strategic approach, like a tactician carefully pulling pieces into place. Her first step was reconnecting with James, the man she had spoken to that night. Susan knew James was starting to feel uneasy about Michael's decisions. He had always been cautious, and watching Michael's missteps unfold was making him anxious about the company's future. But James was also discreet and measured. He wouldn't move without reassurance. That's why Susan decided to take a different approach, to make him feel personally responsible for driving change. "Look at what's happening to the company, James," Susan said during a private meeting. "The people we've worked with for years are starting to feel unsafe. Our relationships are fracturing because the new leadership lacks vision. Michael doesn't understand the undercurrents in this industry. He thinks swapping out a few people will fix everything, but it's not that simple." James listened, his eyes betraying a growing sense of concern. "I know, but things could change if we act together." "We will," Susan said, her voice calm but firm. "But we need to be fully prepared. I need your support when the time comes, because I know we're the only ones who can stop these mistakes before they become irreversible." James nodded, realizing she was inviting him into something much bigger than he had imagined. But he also understood, if they didn't act, they risked losing everything they had built. With James on her side, Susan moved to expand her plan, bringing in other influential voices from inside and outside the company. She wouldn't just highlight Michael's financial mistakes, she would expose the full range of weaknesses in his vision and leadership. She would prove that he wasn't just unqualified to lead, he lacked a basic understanding of what was necessary for the company's survival. She also started quietly reaching out to the remaining executives inside the company. They might not have understood the reasons behind Susan's moves, but they were beginning to see that Michael couldn't continue to lead. She subtly planted the idea that things were unstable, that it was time for a new direction. Every meeting, every exchange, was a deliberate step in her strategy. Before long, Michael started to notice small shifts in the people around him. His relationships with key partners began to fray. Questions about his strategies and decisions were being raised more frequently. And internally, hesitation started to creep into important conversations. What Michael didn't know was that all of it, every whisper, every hesitation, was Susan quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes. The time had come. Susan felt a new energy inside her, stronger than ever. She was no longer the one cast aside. She had returned, not just to reclaim justice for herself, but to protect everything she had spent years building. Michael's downfall would not come cheap, and she would make sure he understood. Not everyone could be stepped on without consequences. Susan now understood that this was no longer just a financial strategy. She was playing a game of power, one in which every move, every action had to be calculated with precision. She had garnered enough support from key stakeholders, and she knew that to bring Michael down, she needed to deliver a seismic shock, a decisive move no one could ignore. At a critical shareholders' meeting, Michael presented the latest financial reports of the company. Everything seemed fine, at least on paper. But a few numbers in the report made Susan feel something was off. She already knew that Michael lacked the foresight she possessed, and now his ignorance of long-term financial strategies was turning into a fatal weakness. During the same meeting, Michael confidently began his presentation, announcing a series of restructuring strategies he was implementing. Susan sat quietly, her eyes locked on him. She listened to every word, but her mind was focused on the flaws in the financial report, errors Michael couldn't even see. As the meeting neared its end, Susan knew it was time to act. She stood up slowly, and every eye in the room turned to her. Michael looked stunned, seemingly unaware that Susan would even be present at this meeting. A tense silence fell across the room, and a few people began murmuring, exchanging curious glances. Raising her hand slightly, Susan gave a soft smile and said, "Michael, I noticed a few points in your report that need clarification. It seems there are some financial decisions that were overlooked when planning for the future of this company." The room fell completely silent. Michael, unaccustomed to being challenged on financial matters, tried to remain composed. "Susan, I don't think this is the right time to create disruption with unnecessary questions." "Perhaps," Susan replied calmly, "but if I don't bring clarity to these issues now, we could be facing major financial risks no one here is prepared for. So, I believe it's time I present a more detailed analysis." With undeniable confidence, Susan began to lay out the weaknesses in Michael's financial report. She not only highlighted inconsistencies in the numbers, but also explained the consequences of his poor decisions on strategic partnerships and long-term investments. She questioned his restructuring strategy and pointed out that what he called innovation was, in fact, a series of hasty moves lacking a solid foundation. Under Susan's guidance, the numbers came alive, clearly showing their impact on the company. She didn't need to raise her voice or use harsh words. Every figure, every analysis was like a needle, precisely piercing the weakest parts of Michael's strategy. When Susan finished her analysis, the room remained still for a moment before quiet murmurs began to rise. Veteran shareholders started exchanging thoughts on Susan's points, while Michael stood frozen, unable to defend himself. She had backed him into a corner. Executives and shareholders in the room began to question Michael's leadership. Slowly, attention shifted to Susan. Finally, one of the shareholders stood up and said, "I think we need to reevaluate the entire strategy. What Susan's pointed out may be serious issues we need to address immediately." Michael, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, had no choice but to quietly retreat. This was the moment Susan knew she had won. The meeting ended in a heavy silence, and Susan could feel the shift in the room. The looks people gave her were no longer skeptical. They were respectful and full of admiration. The company's power players were beginning to realize what she had known all along. Michael lacked the vision to steer the company through the challenges ahead. Despite his confident front, his actions were built on shaky ground. As the meeting concluded, several shareholders and executives approached Susan. They didn't just praise her sharp analysis, they also expressed concern about the company's future under Michael's leadership. One of them, John, the CFO, spoke up. "Susan, we believe your insights are incredibly valuable. We'd like to hear more of your thoughts on what direction we should take next." Susan looked John and the others in the eye. This was her moment, one she had been waiting for. And she knew she couldn't let it pass. It was time to consolidate her power. "We need a complete transformation. We can't continue operating the way we have been," Susan said, her tone calm but assertive. "This company needs a leader with long-term vision, someone who can make the right decisions under any circumstance. And I believe I can be that person." The executives and shareholders exchanged glances. They were no longer hesitant or confused. Susan had not only presented a clear picture of the company's reality, she had shown strength and capability. Everything they lacked in Michael, Susan possessed. That was why they were now leaning her way. A few hours later, Susan received a call. It was James, the person she had convinced earlier. Susan, they're holding a meeting now to make a decision, and I can tell you that the majority of shareholders are siding with you. Michael seems to have lost their trust completely. The feeling of victory filled Susan's mind, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate just yet. This was only the first step in a much larger plan. She knew she had to truly master the game, not just regain recognition, but deliver a decisive blow to seize full control. With backing from veteran shareholders, Susan accelerated the process. She called for an emergency shareholders meeting where she would formally propose a restructuring of the leadership team. She wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of her victory. Michael would not only be removed as CEO, he would be held accountable for all the missteps he had made. The emergency meeting was held late in the afternoon. Everything was in place. Michael sat across from Susan, and the change in atmosphere was palpable. Everyone had seen the truth, and now their former indifference toward him had turned into a quiet but powerful push for change. Susan stood up, commanding the room's attention once again. Her gaze was sharp, fearless. "We can't go on like this," Susan began, her voice calm but convincing. "Michael has made too many irreparable decisions. It's time this company had a leader with clear vision and deep industry knowledge. Michael had his chance, but he's no longer capable. I propose that we begin a major turning point for the company." A few shareholders nodded, well aware that it was time to pull the company out of chaos. Others quietly glanced at Michael, but their eyes no longer held sympathy, only cold detachment. Michael could feel the shift. People in the room began turning to look at her, then back at him, their expressions no longer cautious, but firm. Finally, one of the major shareholders stood up and spoke clearly and decisively. "We agree. Michael, we're going to restructure the company and find new leadership. Thank you for your efforts, but it's time to move on." Michael was stunned, unable to believe what he was hearing. To him, it felt like a gut punch. He couldn't understand how the people who once supported him had turned their backs so quickly. But just as he was about to respond, Susan stepped in with a calm, proud smile. "Thank you, Michael. From now on, I will lead this company back to the true values we originally built it on." After Michael was removed, Susan faced a greater challenge than ever before. It wasn't just about repairing the damage from his strategic missteps. It was about rebuilding the trust of the employees, shareholders, and customers. What she accomplished that day wasn't merely a personal victory. It was an opportunity to rebuild the foundation she had poured years of hard work into. When Susan stepped into the CEO's office, she didn't feel triumphant, only a deep sense of responsibility. She looked around the room, once a symbol of power, now feeling hollow. The awards on the walls, the outdated strategy documents, they all felt meaningless. She knew the company had changed drastically, and now it was her turn to define the path forward. Her job wasn't just about managing numbers. It was about understanding people, employees, shareholders, even customers. Susan always believed that true leadership wasn't only about financial vision, but human connection. She had seen people like Michael focus solely on profit and forget that a company isn't just figures on a spreadsheet. A company is people, the ones who work, create, and give everything to help it grow. In her first days as CEO, Susan decided to hold an informal meeting with the senior staff. She wanted them to know she wasn't an outsider to the company's reality, she was part of it. She began by asking them to share the challenges they had faced during Michael's tenure. These conversations helped her grasp the true state of the company and started building trust and connection with the team. One early morning, Susan met with the management team and opened the meeting with a simple but profound question. Where do we want this company to go in the next year? And how can we make sure we protect not just our profits, but our core values? The team members shared their thoughts. Some were concerned that rapid changes might disrupt the work environment, while others expressed hope for a brighter future under her leadership. Susan listened carefully to each person, never interrupting, making sure everyone felt their voice mattered. After the meeting, Susan had a clearer understanding of the current landscape. She knew regaining trust wouldn't happen overnight. But she also knew that with the right strategy, patience, and smart decisions, she could bring the company back. She would not repeat Michael's mistake of chasing short-term gains. Her goal was to build a sustainable business, one rooted in honesty, respect, and trust. Susan began reviving some of the company's older strategies, but also adapted them to meet the changing market. She reopened negotiations with strategic partners, insisting on adjustments to protect the company's long-term interests. New contracts were signed, and gradually, the company started seeing positive signs. One of the most critical steps was rebuilding relationships with major clients. Susan didn't want to just send apologies or offer hollow promises. She knew trust had to be earned through action. So, she arranged face-to-face meetings with key clients to explain the company's changes and assure them of the improved products and services that would better meet their needs. Slowly, old clients began to return. While not everyone came back right away, step by step, Susan succeeded in repairing the damaged relationships. She understood that once trust was reestablished, recovery would be faster and more sustainable than ever. With every step forward, Susan's company continued to recover and grow. The strategic decisions she made weren't always immediately embraced, but over time, their impact became clear. Still, not everyone welcomed the company's rebound. A new battle began, not only from within, but from external forces and competitors. One of the greatest challenges Susan faced was a smear campaign launched by a rival company, led by a group of influential shareholders in the industry. They began spreading damaging rumors about Susan's company, claims of financial troubles, poor management, and leadership instability, an orchestrated attempt to erode trust and create panic among customers. To Susan, this was a war she couldn't avoid. She had been pushed out once before, and she wouldn't let it happen again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Shareholders and employees who had seen the positive change she brought began to stand by her. Susan understood that to maintain the company's stability, she had to handle the situation with intelligence and care. She couldn't afford to be impulsive, even though her heart was burning with urgency. Susan began contacting strategic partners and shareholders to build a strong counteroffensive. She didn't just need to defend the company, she had to restore confidence among customers and the public. She decided to host a live online conference with key shareholders and major clients, where she would speak candidly about the company's current state, outline the strategic reforms underway, and highlight the achievements they had made. We cannot allow rumors and unethical competition to undermine what we've built and are continuing to build, Susan said in a meeting with the management team. Let us prove that not only are we standing strong, we're stronger than ever. Now is the time to show the power of perseverance and long-term vision. Immediately afterward, Susan launched a powerful media strategy. She didn't just revamp the company's public messaging, she personally took part in interviews and conferences to demonstrate both her strength and the company's resilience. She emphasized that the company was thriving under her leadership, not because of deep financial pockets, but because of sound strategy and a strong leadership team. One of Susan's boldest moves was publicly confronting her competitor during a press conference. The entire industry was watching, waiting for her response. When the rival was forced to address the issue publicly, Susan's sharp, articulate words didn't just dismantle their arguments, she backed them up with clear examples of how her company had overcome similar challenges, exposing the attacks for what they really were, political games played by competitors. At the press conference, Susan spoke calmly, but with unwavering confidence. Our company will never be shaken by baseless accusations. We remain committed to our customers, shareholders, and employees. Our success doesn't just come from overcoming difficulties, it comes from refusing to let those who wish to see us fail shake our belief in ourselves. Her words sent shockwaves through the business community. Despite strong backing, her rival couldn't counter the truth and clarity of Susan's message. Gradually, even their shareholders began to waver, losing confidence in their leadership. Not only did Susan's company preserve its reputation, it surged forward, stronger than ever. Susan's sound strategies and persistence proved that she wasn't just the head of a company, she was someone capable of facing any challenge. When the battle finally ended, her company stood taller than ever before. And Susan had once again shown that true leadership isn't just about strength, it's about wisdom, patience, and resilience. Looking back, Susan couldn't help but feel proud of what she had accomplished. But that pride didn't come with complacency. She knew a company couldn't grow forever by relying on old strategies or past decisions. The world was always changing, and her company needed to change with it. Now, it wasn't about defending herself or the company from outside attacks. It was about building a sustainable future, one where the company could weather any storm and keep growing. Susan understood that while they had survived the turbulence, going further would require a long-term development strategy, one focused not only on profits, but on building a legacy. In an important meeting with the leadership team, Susan began sharing her vision for the years ahead. She said, "We don't just want to stay standing, we need to grow sustainably. I don't want our company to just be a player in today's market. I want us to be a part of the future." The room went silent. All eyes were on her, waiting for what would come next. Susan continued, "We're not just going to focus on optimizing current processes, we're going to invest in technology and innovative solutions to meet the evolving needs of the market. If we want to maintain our position, we must stay ahead." She wasn't just talking about product and service changes. Susan also emphasized building a strong company culture. She wanted to create a workplace where every employee felt respected, empowered, and encouraged to share their ideas. It was a strategy she believed would not only sustain the company but help it thrive in the long run. One of her initiatives was investing in employee training and development. Susan knew that building a sustainable company required not just a clear vision, but also a talented and committed team. She proposed that every employee, from senior executives to junior staff, have access to skills development courses, especially in areas like technology and innovation. She also stressed the importance of maintaining sustainable partnerships. Susan held strategic meetings with key partners to discuss expanding collaborative efforts in international markets. This wasn't just about finding new opportunities, it was about boosting the company's brand reputation and long-term value. Every partnership was a solid step toward greater stability and growth potential. Susan never lost sight of shifting customer behavior. She began studying emerging market trends and developing products tailored to the needs of younger generations. Changes in technology, consumer habits, and the rise of sustainable values were key elements she wanted the company to pursue. From that, she launched new innovation projects like using artificial intelligence to enhance customer service and optimize production processes. One of Susan's major decisions was to shift the company's communication strategy. No longer just promoting products, she aimed to shape the company's image as open-minded and receptive to new ideas. The company wouldn't just be a provider, it would become part of the customer's life, a partner helping them grow and improve their quality of living. In the months that followed, Susan's initiatives began yielding visible results. Employees became more engaged, the company attracted new partners and customers, and its technological foundation grew stronger. Once again, she proved that patience, foresight, and adaptability are the keys to leading a company through challenges and toward lasting success. As she looked out the office window, Susan knew the road ahead was long. But she was ready. She was no longer just a leader, she was shaping the future of an empire, crafting a legacy to leave for the next generation. And within her, there was no fear of being left behind, only pride and peace. Because she knew she had done the right thing, she had triumphed not through revenge, but through steadfastness and intelligence. As the company grew stronger, Susan increasingly understood that for a leader, stability is never permanent. Though she had led the company through crises and defeated many adversaries, she also realized the greatest challenge had never been there. It wasn't about external competition anymore. It was about sustaining long-term growth and continuing to build on the values Susan had worked so hard to establish. One day, during a meeting with shareholders and the executive board, Susan was faced with a tough decision. One of the strategic projects she had pinned her hopes on, a project she believed would bring transformational change to the company, was starting to run into problems. It was a major leap forward in developing new tech products, but after a period of testing, the results were falling short. Performance indicators weren't meeting expectations, and the market feedback wasn't as positive as anticipated. While many members of her team still believed in the project's potential, some key shareholders were beginning to express concern about the massive investment the company had poured into it. Tension hung heavy in the room. Susan looked around at the faces, shareholders, longtime colleagues, trusted partners. She knew this was a pivotal moment, one that could shape the future of the company. Should they pull back, shut it down, or push forward? Part of her wanted to cut losses, abandon the project if there was no clear path to improvement. But another part, the stronger, more resilient part of her, the one rooted in vision, refused to back down. Susan knew that if this project succeeded, it could propel the company to an entirely new level. But if it failed, it could set them back significantly, harming not only their reputation, but also their financial standing. As the others began debating next steps, Susan remained silent. She didn't rush to respond. She thought carefully. She remembered the tough times she had faced before, moments when everything felt like it was teetering on the edge. And yet, it was in those moments that she had learned some of the most valuable lessons about patience, resilience, and long-term vision. Finally, after weighing everything, Susan spoke, clear, confident, and decisive. "We can't walk away now. This project may not be perfect, but that's not a reason to quit. I want us to keep investing in it, not to prove we were right, but to prove we're not afraid to fail. We will revise the strategy, reinforce our resources, and find a way to turn this challenge into an opportunity." She looked directly at the shareholders, not with fear, but with conviction. "I know this decision isn't easy, but I believe it's the right one. We can't live off our past successes. We have to keep moving forward. Give me one more chance to prove we can do this." The energy in the room began to shift. Shareholders and leadership began to realize that, while the risks were real, they couldn't ignore the clarity and strength Susan brought to the table. Some agreed with her immediately. Others remained cautious. But they all agreed to give her that chance. This decision wasn't just about the company. It was about Susan herself. She knew no path to the top was easy, but it was courage in the face of uncertainty that had always helped her build the future she dreamed of. And as the project began to evolve, Susan became even more certain. Her decision had been the right one, a necessary step toward taking the company to greater heights. A few weeks after that pivotal moment, the company began to see real change. While the tech project hadn't turned around overnight, there were signs of recovery. Under Susan's direction, the research team focused on improving key components while also launching new initiatives, adding features to better align the product with market needs. Although challenges still loomed, progress was visible. Just as the company was regaining its footing, a new issue emerged, this time from outside. Several competitors began entering the same sector Susan's company had been focusing on, armed with bold strategies and deep resources. These companies weren't just releasing similar products, they were launching aggressive media campaigns, promising to redefine the industry. It wasn't good news. Susan knew that despite the company's strong foundation, it would have to confront this new wave of competition head-on. She sat in a conference room with her leadership team, reviewing charts and market data. The pressure had returned. One of the directors, a longtime supporter, spoke up. "What do we do now, Susan? If we keep pouring resources into this project, we could be going head-to-head with much larger companies." They have stronger funding, more creative teams, and marketing machines that are already dominating the conversation. Susan looked at her team, not with worry, but with fierce determination. "We've faced bigger challenges than this. I'm not someone who backs down when things get hard. If we want to survive in this industry, we can't just change strategy. We have to change mindset. We're not here to chase the race. We're here to lead it," she continued. "We're not just going to focus on the competition, we're going to focus on becoming the leader of this industry. Let's see our competitors as an opportunity to prove we can overcome anything. We'll improve our product, expand into new markets, and innovate relentlessly." The leadership team listened intently. Susan had always been the one to chart the company's long-term vision, and her words still carried undeniable weight. But this time, her message wasn't just about protecting the company's position. It was about defending its core values. Still, not everyone was on board. Some members of the finance department started raising concerns about the growing expenses needed to keep pace with competitors. They questioned whether the company could handle further financial pressure without guaranteed returns. But Susan refused to let doubt derail her. She knew that focusing only on short-term survival would never lead to long-term growth. "We're going to change how we work," she said firmly. "We won't follow the same worn-out paths. We'll innovate. I want you to focus on the opportunities we have, not just the challenges we face. A company can only endure if it keeps reinventing itself." Soon after, Susan began preparing for a high-stakes meeting with major shareholders. Her goal: to present a bold, ambitious strategy, expanding into international markets and developing cutting-edge tech products aligned with emerging global trends. These were areas the company had yet to fully explore, but Susan believed they would be the key to maintaining their position in the industry. For Susan, this wasn't just about protecting the company anymore, it was also about protecting herself. Her past efforts weren't only to prove her leadership capabilities, but to build a strong foundation for the future. Although the outcome was uncertain, she was confident she had made the right decision. When Susan decided to double down on international strategy and focus on sustainable technology, she understood the road ahead would be filled with challenges and risks. But without bold moves, the company would remain stagnant in a mature market and eventually be overtaken by competitors. That was something she simply could not accept. In the days that followed, Susan and her leadership team worked tirelessly to develop detailed strategies for expanding into international markets. Meetings were held one after another, each one presenting new hurdles, from identifying strategic partners in foreign countries to designing products that met both consumer needs and regulatory demands unique to each market. Despite the exhaustion, Susan never wavered. She kept her eyes on the long-term goal, the opportunity that awaited if they succeeded. Eventually, the company decided to launch a pilot project in Europe, a market it had never entered before. This wasn't just about introducing new tech products. It was a bold push towards sustainable development, leveraging the rise of green consumer trends in the region. On the first day of meetings with international partners, Susan could feel the tension in the room. The attendees were industry experts, hard to impress, and even harder to convince. Though she had come fully prepared with a detailed proposal, skepticism still lingered in their eyes. When it was her turn to speak, the room fell silent. Susan looked each person in the eye, sensing both their skepticism and their guarded hope. "We're not just bringing you a product," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "We're offering a solution grounded in both technology and sustainability. One that we truly believe has the potential to transform this industry." She paused briefly, then continued, "But more than that, this is your opportunity to become strategic partners. Together, we can expand the market and create lasting value for our communities and for future generations. We're not afraid of challenges. We believe what we're offering will make a real difference. That's the key to thriving in today's marketplace." She let her words hang in the air for a moment before finishing, "I know we're not your only option. But if you're looking for a partner committed to long-term success, we are your best option. Let's build something that matters together." The silence remained, but something had shifted. The skepticism in the room began to give way to attentiveness. The partners started asking more detailed questions about product development strategy, market entry, and the company's commitments to environmental protection. Susan answered calmly and precisely, walking them through each step of the plan and explaining how it would lead to measurable results. At last, one of the major European partners stood up and said, "We've heard similar promises from other companies, but the level of commitment and long-term vision you've shown is genuinely impressive. We're ready to move forward together." It was a first win, but only the beginning of a much longer journey. Susan couldn't help but think about the months ahead and the obstacles that would come from operating on a global stage. Still, she knew, once action had begun, there was no turning back. But as Susan had learned, transformation didn't come only from breaking into new markets. It also came from how she worked with people inside the company. The original shareholders who had backed the international strategy were now growing weary. They wanted tangible results and fast. Internal pressure was mounting, and Susan found herself facing yet another risky decision. The international project, which Susan had placed so much hope in, had started to show early signs of success. But not everyone in the company was pleased with the pace or scale of progress. The major shareholders, those with final say over the company's direction, were beginning to express concern. In particular, Robert, a key shareholder who had long supported Susan through the company's restructuring, was becoming skeptical. He was a long-term investor with vision, but also a pragmatist who expected quick, visible results. While the pilot project had shown promise, the high initial costs and lack of clear short-term returns made him uneasy. One morning, as Susan stepped into her office, she received an urgent call from Robert. His opening words struck a nerve. "Susan, we need to talk. I'm really worried about your recent decisions. Everything feels too slow, too risky. We can't keep burning through cash without seeing results." Susan could hear the tension in his voice. It was true, the project hadn't yet turned a profit as fast as people had hoped. But she also knew that real, lasting strategy didn't yield overnight success. All she could do now was hold her ground and convince those who were beginning to waver. She sat at her desk, glanced at her packed schedule, and prepared for the call to come. This was a make-or-break moment. If she couldn't hold the shareholders' trust, everything she'd built could unravel. That afternoon, a critical meeting was held with the major shareholders, including Robert. Susan arrived with a clear plan and a steady resolve, ready for the tough questions. As she opened the meeting, she could see the doubt in their eyes, especially Robert's, and for a brief moment, she felt a wave of anxiety. But she pushed it aside. This was her moment to lead, just as she had so many times before. "Change is never easy," Susan began, her voice calm but unwavering. "I understand that everyone wants immediate results, but sometimes the most significant steps take time. We can't measure success by short-term metrics alone. If we continue investing in this international project, I can assure you, within 18 months, we will capture a substantial share of the market. In the European and Asian markets, the profits will come, but only if we remain patient and keep working hard." Susan continued outlining the next steps in the strategy, including necessary adjustments to minimize costs and accelerate partnership building in international regions. While she might have felt a flicker of anxiety, all she could do now was present solid reasoning and maintain the shareholders' confidence in the company's future. Robert and the other shareholders remained silent for a moment. The air in the room was thick with tension. Susan looked at each of them, sensing their thoughts. Each second felt like a century. Finally, Robert spoke. "We don't want to miss this opportunity, Susan. But I can't take that risk without seeing more clarity on short-term results. You need to prove that your strategy is on the right track." Susan nodded and replied calmly, "I understand, Robert. And I won't let you down. We'll conduct a review in 6 months, and I'll provide you with more detailed reports. But remember, great opportunities always come with great risks. That's how we move forward. The meeting ended in silence, but at least Susan had demonstrated her resolve. She knew she would have to continue persuading the shareholders, especially Robert. But now she was fighting not just for the company, but for what she believed in. Susan couldn't stop thinking about the meeting with the shareholders. Robert's words still echoed in her mind. We can't take that risk without more clarity on short-term results. It cut deep because Susan knew that, in many people's eyes, she was taking a gamble, and she didn't yet have enough evidence to prove her strategy was the right one. After the meeting, she sat alone in her office, quietly staring out the window. She thought back to when she first joined the company, that mix of excitement and drive. Today, that feeling had dulled, replaced by fatigue and unease. The company had made significant progress, but could she weather the storm? The feeling of uncertainty wouldn't leave her. Could she stay the course with no one standing beside her? Could this international strategy really succeed, or was it just a never-ending gamble? One night, sitting alone in her silent office, Susan had a realization. This was a defining moment. She couldn't let fear and doubt take over. If she gave up now, everything she'd fought for would be meaningless. She remembered why she committed to this strategy, not just to save the company, but to prove that a woman, no matter her age, could still lead and transform a major corporation on the global stage. Though her worries didn't vanish completely, they were replaced by a new sense of determination. Susan rose from her chair and walked to her desk, where her international strategic plan lay. Picking up a pen, she started writing down short-term goals, specific metrics she needed to hit to convince the shareholders the strategy was working. The more she thought, the more she realized she couldn't just rely on numbers. She had to create real, tangible change that the shareholders couldn't ignore. One morning, just before stepping into a crucial meeting with a major international partner, Susan felt a shift in her mindset. It was time to act boldly and decisively. She needed everyone to see that she was doing the right thing. She had a plan, but now she needed to back it up with strength and resolve, not just words. As she entered the meeting room, she sensed skeptical eyes from the shareholders. But instead of feeling anxious, Susan felt a surprising calm. She opened the meeting by sharing the latest numbers on the progress of the international project, but rather than focusing solely on data, she told a story. We can't judge success by short-term results alone, she began. I've seen many large-scale projects like this before, and I know that sometimes patience is the most critical investment. What matters most is that we are investing in a long-term vision, not just numbers, but real value we're bringing to the market. Together, we'll build a sustainable future, not just for the company, but for the communities we serve. Susan's words, though simple, were firm and clear, and they began to shift the mood in the room. The shareholders stopped looking only at the numbers and started seeing the vision and commitment she was offering. She had shown that not every business decision could be measured by immediate profit. Most importantly, she had painted a clear path forward, one that gave others hope that with patience and continued effort, the company would achieve great things. The meeting ended with nods of approval. There were no grand declarations of victory, but Susan could feel the change in the shareholders' attitudes. She hadn't just won the meeting, she had won a battle within herself, overcoming the doubts and fears that once haunted her. Everything changed after that critical meeting. Susan knew she had skillfully navigated a storm, but she also understood the battle wasn't over. The shareholders still had doubts, and the pressure from within the company continued to mount. She couldn't afford to rest on one successful meeting. She had to keep proving she was right. Over the next several weeks, Susan worked relentlessly, monitoring every fluctuation in the international project, compiling detailed reports, and adjusting strategies. She spent most of her time engaging with international partners, pushing forward new agreements and refining communication plans to ensure the company gained visibility in key markets. Then one sunny morning, a surprising announcement came from the communications team. The company had signed a major contract with a partner in Asia. Not only would it bring in a wave of new customers, but it also helped expand their international business network. This was one of the contracts Susan had long hoped for. When the news broke, the atmosphere inside the company shifted immediately. The shareholders began to recognize the value of the strategy Susan had outlined. The earlier doubts slowly gave way to a renewed sense of optimism. Susan's exhaustion and anxiety started to lift. She knew she had crossed a major milestone. But for Susan, this victory wasn't the end goal. She knew that in order to sustain and grow, the company had to stay the course. And above all, she never forgot why she began this journey, not just for the company, but to prove that she could take control of her own destiny, despite the doubts and lack of faith from others. While the sense of victory hadn't yet settled, Susan was already planning her next move. She didn't stop at the initial success, but continued to push forward with expansion strategies into other regions. What mattered most was that Susan had not only regained the trust of the shareholders, but also demonstrated her inner strength and leadership. She had reshaped how both she and the company were perceived, and from this point on, she knew the journey was far from over. As she reviewed the updated financial numbers and saw a clear upward trend, her heart no longer felt weighed down. All of her efforts and sacrifices were finally beginning to pay off. And even though the road ahead still held many challenges, Susan was ready to face them. Everything was moving in the right direction. The major success of the Asia contract had put Susan and the company in a stronger position. Shareholders had begun to shift their attitudes, and Susan felt a confidence she hadn't experienced in a long time. But as is often the unspoken rule in business, just when things start to go smoothly, the biggest challenge tends to appear. One crisp fall morning, as Susan was preparing for the next shareholders' meeting, she received an unexpected phone call from Robert, the former CEO who had once pushed her out. This time, his voice was different, no longer cold and distant, but laced with anxiety. "Can we meet, Susan?" he asked. "I need your help. We're facing a serious financial crisis, and I think you're the only one who can save the company." Robert's words struck her like a blade. She was no longer the woman he once dismissed. She had reclaimed her place and power within the company, and now he was coming to her, asking for help. In that moment, Susan's emotions swirled. Her pride flared, her sense of self-worth surged, but a small part of her couldn't completely shut the door on the past. After all, Robert had once played a role in her early career. But he was also the man who had cast her aside at the peak of her success. Susan sat in her office, quietly reflecting. This could be a pivotal opportunity to help the company overcome a financial storm, but it also raised a difficult question. Could she forgive and collaborate with the man who once brought her down? The inner conflict made time feel suspended. She remembered the countless sleepless nights spent proving her worth, the sting of being pushed out, but also the moment she stood tall and confidently affirmed that she was the rightful leader of this company. At last, Susan made a decision. She called Robert and agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe outside the city. It was a difficult choice, but she knew that if she wanted to maintain her power and steer the company's future, she needed to propose a deal that wouldn't just save Robert, it would strengthen her own position. Their meeting unfolded in a tense atmosphere. Robert looked thinner, worn down by stress and financial strain. As he laid out the dire situation, Susan remained composed outwardly, but inside, she knew this was her defining moment. This wasn't about revenge, it was about finally taking control. After listening, Susan didn't rush to give an answer. Instead, she proposed a bold plan, a financial deal that, if Robert agreed to it, would require him to give up all control and authority over the company. Susan would officially take the helm, overseeing investments and operations. Robert hesitated, but the desperation in his eyes left him little choice. He signed the agreement, conceding defeat and handing over the reins to Susan. With quiet precision, she took back everything that had once been stripped from her. As their meeting ended, Susan didn't feel triumphant, but a wave of power began to rise within her. This was a victory not just in terms of business, but also personal. She hadn't only saved the company, she had proven that no one could discard her so easily, and that every move she made was measured, deliberate, and decisive.